Welcome. Let's get started. So the catalyst for this video was a news item that spurred a pretty big reaction online. The famous car manufacturer BMW is apparently rolling out a subscription service that locks quite a few in-car features behind a paywall, including heated seats and a number of other features that might be considered luxuries. The gaming news sector has been all over this, since it bears striking resemblance to game industry monetization tactics of recent years. For many, this move by BMW is indicative of a large-scale shift to the subscription model, especially in industries where subscriptions haven't previously been common. But even if we look to industries where the service model has already been normalized, we can see a similar amount of potential for change in the near future. In the world of streaming entertainment, Netflix's financial woes and their promise to integrate advertising as part of a new subscription tier have raised the possibility of that landscape shrinking. I want to talk about subscriptions within the specific context of this exact moment in time, July of 2022, because the popularity and standards of streaming are already very different than they were a few years ago, and a few years in the future, they'll probably look different than they do right now. I'll be talking about the trajectories of subscription services in a general sense, and then I'll talk specifically about the subscription model as it applies to media consumption and our relationship with media. Basically, I think this is important. I think the topic of subscriptions is important, and thinking about subscriptions brings up some crucial questions. I want to ask them of myself and also of anybody who happens to watch the video. Over the last 15 years, roughly, multiple major industries have essentially transitioned into service models, namely the software and entertainment industries. It hasn't been a full transition in either case, but this is still extremely significant. So why did they do this? Well, in a basic sense, they did this because it meant lots more money coming in, and this money was both consistent and relatively easy. So Adobe, just as one example, previously sold software packages outright, with their full creative suite costing between $900 and $1,200 back in 2005. You bought the software, and then you owned those copies of that software for the foreseeable future. But the company started to wither, and in 2013, Adobe switched to a subscription model called the Creative Cloud. And the result? Between 2013 and 2020, company revenue quadrupled from $4 billion to $16 billion. Microsoft switched from offering a perpetual license for their Office suite for about $400 to offering a subscription for $10 a month. Office 365, as it's called, now has over 50 million active subscribers, and Microsoft has also reported a 22% growth rate there. GoPro launched a subscription service when profits started to drop off, and their gross margin has since increased by 11%. The game industry has leaned into the subscription model with gusto, let's say, and the approach is now called games as service. You might have to pay a subscription fee to get continued access to a game, or you might pay a subscription fee to access just bonus content for a game, the latter of which is sometimes made to seem more appealing to players through the use of behavioral psychology. Or hey, you might pay a subscription fee to have continued access to a whole library of games, a la Game Pass, following the entertainment streaming model. Now again, there's very clear appeal to subscriptions, at least from the business perspective, and this is also a perspective which doesn't often consider some pretty important factors, I think, like human impact, long-term customer relationships, and the sheer impossibility of limitless growth. Successful subscription models result in large amounts of consistent, reliable revenue, and the cost of retaining a subscription customer is relatively low. Even from the psychological side, subscriptions turn recurring spending from a customer from an active decision into a passive decision. It makes that recurring spending much more likely. Maybe a weird example, but let's say that someone's buying Coca-Cola at the store every week, or at least most weeks. Now, there's always a chance that they might not buy it one day. They might choose another brand, or they might not buy any soda at all. But if that person has agreed to get Coca-Cola delivered to their doorstep once a week, they're locked in, and they're no longer confronted by choice. They're not spending time in the soda aisle looking at the competition's products. So subscriptions offer tons of opportunities to increase revenue, and value-based management also happens to be common in many of the companies operating today, specifically companies that are publicly traded. Value-based management, as this piece here explains, is the idea that maximizing shareholder value should be the guiding principle when making strategic decisions. If you follow entertainment closely, then you've probably heard of company shareholder meetings, where leadership within the company tries to make the company as a whole look as incredible as possible to shareholders in the hopes of having them continue to invest in the company. While shareholders are literally invested in specific companies, they're not tied to them. They can jump ship at basically any time because they're not actually part of the company. They don't work there. They just invest some cash and hope to get a lot of cash back over time. So this value-based management approach results in a situation where company leadership is often making decisions specifically because they expect those decisions to result in company performance that will make shareholders happy. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say that plenty of shareholders maybe aren't considering the extreme long-term effects of decisions that deliver really beneficial short-term results, or maybe they're not even considering the results outside of their financial gain. Shareholders want their returns to go up and up and up. If there are any signs to trouble, they're much more likely to jump ship. And revenue stagnation or even losses are definitely considered signs of trouble. So a lot of companies were and are looking for ways to promote massive growth pretty much all the time. And the subscription model has offered exactly that for many of these companies, at least so far. Companies want you to stay subscribed for literally your entire life, if possible. And as long as you're subscribed, they can tweak any number of parameters they want to deliver more good news for the shareholders and for themselves. These changes also tend to be very gradual so as to not result in subscriber backlash. This is where we get into price creep and seemingly minor changes to user agreements. A company can decide to provide less or just not update their service or start charging more, in some cases without even telling you about it. Netflix has increased its pricing 6 times since 2011, and we're seeing many other entertainment streaming services increase rates as well, often gradually. Netflix is also a great example of a service that has just lost a lot of value over time, having major movies and series sniped by competing services. We're also seeing many entertainment streaming services incorporate advertising into paid subscription tiers, so now you're looking at subscription revenue and advertising revenue. Subscriptions that provide products that were previously purchasable are also normalizing the idea of paying for these products on a perpetual, recurring basis rather than buying them with one lump sum or even a payment plan. That story about the BMW feature subscription thing really makes it feel like the short and long-term perks of the subscription model are just too tasty to ignore, even in industries that don't warrant a subscription model at all, because the services or products don't actually renew or update over time. So how does this all shake out for actual subscribers? Are we benefiting from this major shift, or are we losing the small amount of power we already had here? And honestly, I think it's a bit of both. Going back to the academic article I referenced earlier, the subscription-based business was previously the realm of telecommunications, magazines, and newspapers. And sure, if we stretch a bit, we could also consider like housing, rent, insurance, and utilities types of subscriptions. But even if we include those, at the time, there was still a pretty clear understanding of why certain services or products had to be subscribed to, why they had to be paid for over and over again. Television, telephone lines, internet connections, and magazines, they're actual services. You are continuing to receive service from a provider over time. These aren't things that last. A TV show airs and then it's gone. Remember, we're talking about the past here. You don't need an internet connection for just 1 month, but every month. Every edition of a magazine is different, covering up-to-date subject matter. Software and entertainment media back then were largely things to own. You bought a piece of software and you had it. You bought a tape or a CD, and you could keep using it until the object itself degraded. The only real limitation was movies and TV, as not every single title was available to purchase for your home video system. None of these product types changed, and so they worked as products. that one Peter Gabriel album would still be exactly the same 2 years down the line. Your copy of System Shock 2 will still have all the same data on it next week, next month, next year. But as software and entertainment subscriptions became the norm, outright ownership dropped off a cliff. And especially when it comes to media, that's both good and bad. In my mind, media subscriptions, in other words, subscriptions to access products that were previously purchased outright, can justify themselves in two major ways. By offering access to a huge wealth of media that would be impractical or impossible to purchase outright, or by offering a product or service that renews over time. This is why I have some major problems with software subscriptions, regardless of whether it's, business productivity software we're talking about or just video games. The big appeal for software subscriptions is supposed to be that they will continue to receive updates over time. Maybe that's just fixes, or maybe it also means additional features. In just about every case, I have not cared about the updates that I receive from software subscription services really at all. The case in point here, I guess, would be the Adobe Suite, the Creative Cloud that I mentioned earlier, and specifically for me, Premiere Pro, which is the editing program that I've been using for the past 6 years or so. So up until about a year ago, I subscribed to Creative Cloud. Initially, I got it for the introductory rate of, I think, like $34 a month. And then eventually that got knocked up to the usual subscription rate, which I think is about $54. And the subscription tiers have recently been increased in price as well. So more evidence of that. Now, while I was subscribed, not even once did updates to Premiere provide me with any kind of additional value for my purposes, for what I was using it for. And more often than anything else, updated versions of the program actually removed features that I regularly used, or it would result in stability issues and I would get more crashes out of it. So while the product was indeed renewing over time, it was doing so in a way that made it less useful and convenient to me. I don't want a renewing, updating, editing program. I just want the editing program. So what I did was I canceled the subscription and I bought an older version of Premiere back from the days when they just made and sold software, and it's great. I just don't have to worry about it and I don't have to pay for it every single month. And I should briefly note here that plenty of other people apparently feel kind of the same way about software, not just with regards to editing software, of course, but plenty of other categories too. We're now seeing a very large number of open source programs that are legitimately competing with major paid software services. And some of these open source competitors offer more value, and all for a rock bottom price of $0. With entertainment media, I think there's a much better argument to be made for continuing to use the subscription model, and that's because some of these subscriptions actually cover both of the key requirements I mentioned earlier. They offer access to massive libraries of content, and they refresh over time with new content. It's still nice to own your favorite movies and albums and shows, but you'd have to spend a whole lot of money to own absolutely everything you want to consume on a regular basis, especially now that we tend to be consuming larger amounts of media more often, but more on that in the next section of the video. But there are obviously negative effects of the widespread switch to the subscription model for us, for the people who subscribe to all this stuff. And one of the big negatives, I think, is the way in which companies also update their user license agreements over time, or EULAs. And this is where things start to get gross, and I probably don't have to tell you how shady it can feel for a company to roll out a massive EULA on your screen, often when you're trying to actually use the service you're paying for. You don't have time to read it, a massive list of rules and agreements. And that's what these are. These are incredibly large legal documents that are very difficult to parse. And if you do put in the effort to read through every updated agreement in toto and find something you don't like, you have no real recourse except to unsubscribe, unless of course you're locked into some kind of subscription agreement for a set period of time, in which case you can't even do that. This is another way in which companies encourage subscriber apathy, regardless of whether or not they're intending to do so. And this is where we roll over into the financial downsides of subscriptions for subscribers. An apathetic subscriber base is extremely desirable for a company. For one thing, an apathetic subscriber is less likely to cancel, and we already know that many people, possibly even a majority of people, are currently enrolled in subscriptions that they don't use, only because they forgot to cancel them. A survey from a company called Hiatus found that 62% of a small sample size said they had paid for unwanted subscriptions because they let auto-renewal lapse after a free trial. I think we've all done that. A study from Chase Bank says that 71% of adults surveyed spend more than $50 a month on unwanted subscription fees. Subscribers who forget to cancel are guaranteed revenue for the company in question. And since they're probably not actually using the service they're paying for, this can also mean lower operating costs. Apathetic subscribers also won't notice when the subscription price increases, which can happen at any time. Just while researching for this video, I came across some scandalous news that I hadn't even heard about. Earlier this year, Apple instituted a new set of rules that allows apps to raise subscription rates without notifying subscribers at all. And that is not a small thing. That is a huge deal. And from my view, it is blatantly anti-consumer, and I'm shocked that there hasn't been any serious blowback on this so far. So all of this has resulted in a company-subscriber relationship in which subscribers have very little power. And in any relationship where there's a major disparity of power, there's a significant chance of abuse. If subscribers want continued access to a given subscription library, they have to agree to everything a company lays down. And unless there are specialized subscription tiers, subscribers will also probably end up paying for a lot of stuff they'll never actually use or access. But the idea that they could potentially access all that stuff can still factor into a subscriber's decision to continue paying. For example, you see streaming services boasting about the sheer size of their libraries all the time. You're not actually going to watch all 5 kajillion Netflix originals, but wow, that sure is a big number. Game Pass is one subscription where I think I'm guilty of falling for this. I probably only play 1 or 2 Game Pass games consistently, games that I could just buy, but I mean, it's just a guarantee that I have about 20 different Game Pass games installed at any given time, because I like the idea that I could play the new Halo if I really wanted to. I'm not going to do it, but I might. I will maybe want to do it at some point in the future. And this goes right back to lapsed subscriptions and paying over and over for stuff we don't use. You could try to really get your money's worth from a particular subscription, but that takes consistent effort. And are you really going to do that for every one of your subscriptions? Do you even know how many active subscriptions you have right now? Because I definitely don't. So most of us are probably already spending too much money each month on subscriptions. Keeping track of them all, as well as their individual pricing changes and EULAs, is basically a job of its own. And most of us probably just don't do all of this. And when we're not looking, the companies behind our subscriptions can kind of do whatever they want. And as subscriptions become even further normalized, I think it's going to be less likely that people will start to question whether or not this is actually a good system for us. And that's one of the biggest reasons why I wanted to make the video at all. Is this good for us? Because based on what we've covered so far, I think it's a very mixed bag, to put it lightly. It's a similar situation at the individual level. Like, depending on your specific circumstances, any given subscription might be an excellent or a terrible idea. I also feel that another major downside to the widespread normalization of subscription models is the way in which it contributes to what's called rentier capitalism. I think that's the right pronunciation, but I know what it is. Rentier capitalism is basically a system where a small handful of people or organizations monopolize ownership of a particular thing. And that ownership allows them to earn large amounts of money on a regular basis. Meanwhile, they're not actually contributing anything to society, they're just sitting on something that the average person can't afford to own. This is already the case in real estate, has been for hundreds of years, and it's becoming the case in software and media as well. If you happen to own something that has a great deal of value, then you're just done. You can just spend your time granting people temporary access at any price you set. And this is a direct contradiction to popular narratives within capitalist societies about having to work hard and contribute. If people accept that more and more things can only be accessed via subscriptions, or in other words, recurring payments that never result in ownership, then rentier capitalism will continue to thrive more than ever before. But that's most of the serious stuff out of the way. And now I would like to talk about subscriptions, specifically as they're related to media consumption. So, for relatively low fees, streaming entertainment provides us with unprecedented access to extremely large libraries of media, especially movies, music, and television shows. Some of the younger folks grew up with this model, but anyone around my age or older can easily remember just how different media consumption was as recently as the early 2000s. Even just music, for example, that was something you needed to purchase, whether it was, physically or digitally, and the only ways to access music you didn't own was to just happen upon it in the wild, or on the radio or store speakers, something like that, or you could borrow a copy from someone else. Today, you can access a very large portion of all recorded music, either completely for free if you're willing to put up with ads, or for the price of a monthly subscription to one of the major streaming services. How has this changed the way you listen to music? And how has this changed the way that you think about music? If we move over to movies and television, the obvious observation is that binge watching is now a thing. Binge watching represents a major change to patterns of media consumption. Stats on binge watching are pretty scattered, so I don't have any for you here, but in a general observational sense, it seems pretty clear that millions of people now consume this type of media in binge sessions, so for hours at a time. Binge watching has also increased our collective appetite for media, I would say, especially new media. So it might have taken years to create a season of a television show, but it can be watched in its entirety within a day. We just want more, specifically more of something that feels similar to what we already like. To meet this powerful appetite for new media, various streaming services and production companies have tried to keep pace, and even that aspect has its benefits and drawbacks. There's so many of these direct streaming projects that have to get made that a lot of them have budgets that are pretty low, and low budgets in turn can translate to bad working conditions and also bad media. However, at the same time, on the positive, the increase in production has also clearly created new opportunities for members of underrepresented groups to create work that they're proud of and work that might even lead to a career in entertainment. Streaming has also changed our view of media ownership, and I don't mean, like rights ownership to a property overall, but rather just owning a copy of a piece of media. So with movies, owning a copy just isn't a very popular option anymore, and it's typically reserved for a handful of personal favorites, or at least that's definitely been the case for me. Now, again, all of this stuff is not necessarily bad news, but we should be asking ourselves how we feel about all of it. We already have very little say in how this landscape progresses outside of, maybe mass subscription boycotts would make a difference. But if there's anything we want to change, we need to know about it right now. Do we want to continue paying subscription fees to access software and media for the rest of our lives? What price would be too high for any given subscription that we have? Do we want companies to be able to raise subscription prices without telling us? Because the answer is no. The future is being formed as we speak, and I feel like most of us just aren't really paying attention. I think there's a point for each person when a subscription ceases to justify its admission fee, and we need to keep an eye out for those moments. And beyond the realm of media, subscription models will no doubt continue to shape our understanding of ownership and the norms of personal finance. So please watch your back, talk about this stuff whenever you can, and try to make it a habit to clear away unwanted subscriptions. Also, I have a Patreon. Oh my goodness, thank you for watching. That was a lot of talking. I don't do that much talking in my daily life, so it's a bit of an exercise for the old voice there. But thank you so much for watching the whole thing. I really, really appreciate it. I know this is a more dense one than what I've been doing recently. But yeah, something I really wanted to make, and I hope it was okay. But that's all for now. Thanks for stopping by.